The sky was the color of molten copper as dawn crept over the harbor of Ugarit. From a marble terrace above the market, a scribe dipped his reed into tarry resin and pressed frantic words into soft clay. He wrote, almost feverishly, "Our land is starving. Send grain to save me and my people," he pleaded, the clay forming each cuneiform mark while the salty breeze stung his eyes. All around, Ugarit gleamed with prosperity. Ships laden with tin and cedar and wine rode at anchor. Merchants in bright robes counted silver ingots. Children chased each other among oil-scented bazaars. The great temples to Baal and Dagon rose against the morning sky, bells of temple lutes softly chiming hymns. Even the sea itself seemed tame, a turquoise glass reflecting that world of abundance. From the docks came the aroma of exotic spices, the clip-clop of loaded donkeys. On this day, life pulsed like a heartbeat, confident and untroubled. And yet a faint hush lingered. Ancient wells were low, fountains trickled into dust, and an uneasy silence followed the sermons of the priests. No storm had come for a generation, and the sun beat down relentlessly, as if daring the world to challenge it. In the bustling harbor, fishermen mended nets woven from flax imported from distant Canaan, while potters shaped amphorae destined for Egyptian palaces, their wheels humming a rhythm that had echoed for centuries. Ugarit was more than a city. It was a nexus, a glittering thread in the vast web of Bronze Age trade that bound empires from the misty isles of the Aegean to the sun-baked valleys of the Nile. By midday, however, the air itself felt heavy. In the great temples of Thebes, the Egyptian priests noted a sandstorm turning the sun crimson at noon, the swirling grains of quartz whispering omens of unrest among the obelisks. In Hattusa, the mountain capital of the Hittites, a tremor split. A statue of the storm god, stone lions at their gates seemed to shiver, their carved manes dusted with fallen mortar. A priest in Sidon saw a holy fire gutter inexplicably, its flames twisting like serpents before dying to embers. Across mountains and desert, portents spoke, the heavens would pour fire or shut us out. Urgent omens, once rare, now appeared everywhere. An aged oracle murmured of coming ruin. When the land itself shakes, the great kings will cry. But nobody knew how far that prophecy would reach. In the oracle's dim chamber, scented with myrrh and flickering with oil lamps, supplicants gathered, farmers with calloused hands clutching offerings of barley, nobles in linen robes seeking assurances for their estates. The air was thick with the scent of fear, as if the gods themselves had drawn a veil over the future, leaving only shadows and whispers. Meanwhile, the world below hummed along those decades-old currents of trade. Ugarit's warehouses housed tin from the mountains of Afghanistan and copper from Cyprus. Amphorae of Nubian wine stood beside jars of Babylonian oil. Scribes copied letters in cuneiform asking about amber and wood and armor, anything to keep the lifeblood of commerce flowing. In Ugarit's cosmopolitan streets, one heard half a dozen tongues, Hittite on carved seals, Egyptian on scarabs, local letters from a new alphabet. Schoolboys practiced sections of the Gilgamesh epic, celebrating Gilgamesh's flood while not suspecting the cataclysm gathering around them. It was a tapestry woven of 1,000 threads, Minoan shipwrights crafting vessels with curved prows that danced on waves, Phoenician glassblowers shaping iridescent beads that caught the light like captured stars, Babylonian smiths forging bronze blades etched with prayers to Marduk. In peace, it was a single family built on reciprocity. In the coming storm, all branches would tremble together. This interconnected realm stretched like a living organism, from the palace economies of Mycenaean Greece, where linear B tablets tallied wool and chariot wheels, to the Hittite archives in Hattusa, where treaties were sealed with oaths to the thunder god, Tahuna. Merchants from Al-Ashir, ancient Cyprus, bartered lapis lazuli from Afghanistan for ivory from Syria. Temples served as banks, storing grain and silver under the watchful eyes of priests who doubled as accountants. Festivals united these distant peoples, the Hittite Puruli spring rite, echoing Minoan bull-leaping ceremonies, binding them in rituals that celebrated abundance and warded off the unseen. Then the worst began. Over the fields of Canaan and Anatolia, the rain simply stopped. Season after season, the sky refused to open. Barley wilted on stalks. The olive tree stood with brittle grey leaves, fruit shriveled on their vines. Even in Egypt, priests noted that the Nile barely crept over its banks, and inscriptions in the sands would later call it the Year of Famine. Farmers abandoned dusty terraces for city walls, hoping for scraps. Herds of starving cattle roamed the empty villages, drooling green foam. Children cried in the streets of Tyre and Acre, their small bodies gaunt, mouths parched. In the ovens of Ugarit, loaves baked by the thousands cooled uneaten on the floor, the bakers themselves too hungry to eat. The drought was no mere dry spell. It was a merciless siege, turning fertile crescents into cracked earth. In the highlands of Anatolia, Hittite farmers watched their terraced fields, once lush with emmer wheat, crumble into dust devils that swirled like vengeful spirits. Along the Levantine coast, olive presses stood idle, their stone wheels silent witnesses to lost harvests. Archaeological cores from ancient lake beds in the Dead Sea region reveal layers of sediment barren of pollen, a stark record of seasons without growth. Families huddled in mud brick homes, rationing the last of their stores, while scribes etched frantic tallies on ostraca, 2 measures of grain for 10 souls. The social fabric frayed as nobles hoarded what little remained, sparking whispers of unrest in the shadows of palace courtyards. And as if drought were not enough, disease joined the assault. A virulent sickness crept out of the south with the starving flies. Cattle broke out in festering pustules. Villagers awoke to find half their children feverish or dead in their beds. Priests scratched desperate glyphs of cure in temple courtyards, pouring libations to every god they knew, but no incense could lift the plague. The air grew thick with the odor of burnt incense and terrified prayers. In barns the goats lay still, eyes glazed. It was as though the gods had unleashed not one calamity but a procession of horrors, first thirst, then hunger, then pestilence. Each day's dawn only brought new nightmares. Skeletal remains from sites like Tel Dir Allah in Jordan show signs of malnutrition and infection. Ribs protruding like cage bars, teeth worn from grinding meager roots. Healers brewed potions from willow bark and mandrake, chanting incantations to drive out demons. But the fever spread unchecked through crowded refugee camps. In Mycenaean tombs, hasty burials cluster together, their grave goods reduced to simple clay pots, as if death came too swiftly for elaborate rites. The plague, perhaps a mycobacterial strain amplified by weakened immunity, turned thriving communities into ghost towns, where the wail of mourners drowned out the calls of seabirds. Rulers watched these tragedies unfold and sent messages like cries for help. King Amurapi of Ugarit once wrote on wet clay, "Send me chariots and shields, O governor of Carchemish. Enemies gather like locusts off our coast." That plea was among the last. From Jerusalem to Sidon, from Carchemish to Memphis, scribes poured out their souls on tablets. Desperate petitions drifted like leaves. "Our granaries have failed, a curse has descended, spare us." Pharaohs held council in dim halls, opening thin jars of grain for the hungry, but each label read, "rationed." Many envoys, empty-handed, turned back as famine drove their people to desperation. Meanwhile, ancient bonds slipped. Governors in distant Anatolia quietly stopped sending tribute. A Canaanite prince allegedly scratched, "House of Mitanni no longer has a king." Without armies to enforce loyalty, some regions declared themselves independent. The whole imperial network was fraying on top of the drought, even before blades were drawn. Diplomatic archives from Amarna in Egypt reveal a crescendo of pleas, vassal kings begging for bronze, grain, or mercenaries, their seals cracking under the pressure of unmet oaths. In Hattusa, royal correspondence piles up unanswered, a paper trail of dissolving alliances. The once mighty Hittite Empire, reliant on tribute from vassals in Syria and the Levant, watched its coffers empty as local lords turned inward, fortifying their own granaries against the encroaching void. By summer's end, the most feared disaster struck. On a burned horizon, Ugarit's watchmen spotted sails not of merchants but of war. At dawn they shouted, "Ships! Warships!" The sea peoples had come. Horned helmets and round shields flashed in the early light as raiders poured onto the beach with a battle cry. King Amurapi, white-bearded and trembling, called it later the Day of Rage. But in that day it was only horror. Bronze arrows darkened the sky, temple columns splintered under siege ladders, the smell of burning cedar mingled with the blood of the fallen. In minutes the proud city wall was aflame. Mothers' shrieks and the crash of statues echoed through ash. By nightfall, Ugarit was silent ash, a ruin glowing red as if the stars themselves had fallen. Excavations at Ras Shamra, modern Ugarit, uncover this finality. A royal archive with half-fired tablets, their words frozen mid-plea, a marketplace strewn with shattered pottery and unclaimed jewelry, as if flight came without time for salvage. The sea peoples, enigmatic migrants from the Aegean or beyond, driven by their own famines, struck like a tidal wave, their feathered headdresses and ox-hide shields a blur in the chaos. Contemporary reliefs from Egyptian temples depict them as tattooed warriors towing families and carts, a nomadic horde unbound by the old world's hierarchies. And elsewhere, the world burned too. Cyprus's great citadel smouldered, Ionia's coasts filled with the dead, even Troy's distant shores may have seen its share of smoke. The Lion Gate of Mycenae stared out over a conquered land, its courtyards scattered with smashed pottery, its throne rooms empty. Hattusa, the Hittite heart, erupted in civil war. Tel Shah Hammam fell into the Euphrates. Phrygia took over its lands. In every direction the pattern repeated. Merchant caravan abruptly halts. Armories emptied for hastily built spears. Temple archives filled with pleas. The synchronized fate of these cities was no accident of nature, but the collapse of a system under too much strain. By 1177 BCE, even Egypt's borders were unsettled. If the pharaoh in Thebes was strong enough to write decrees, he kept them short, saying only, "Victory," where once there would have been campaigns. In the ruins of Pylos, Linear B tablets list frantic inventories. Women to weave more cloth for sails, the enemy approaches. Thebes's granaries, once overflowing with Levantine wheat, echoed with the hollow scrape of empty scoops. The interconnected Bronze Age, a delicate balance of tribute, trade and terror, unraveled like a frayed rope, its strands, from Cretan frescoes to Hittite chariots, snapping one by one. For the Egyptians it was a last great reckoning. Pharaoh Ramesses III, at the mouth of the Nile, met those invaders head-on. He carved the story on temple walls at Medinet Habu, white-armored captives kneeling, piles of arms strewn on the sand. In hieroglyphs he named the sea peoples of myth, the Shardana, the Peliset, the Tiger, and claimed he repulsed them all. His chariots thundered through the delta marshes, killing enemies by boatload. In the morning he stood victorious, but he looked out over a blood-red Nile and no green fields beyond the walls. Even a victory felt hollow. Egypt would survive, but it too recoiled into isolation, no longer the global power it once was. The golden age of the pharaohs quietly ended in those years of drought and war. Ramesses' inscriptions boast of divine favor, but subtle clues betray the toll. Worker strikes etched in tomb graffiti, rations halved for temple artisans. The Nile's inundation, that rhythmic heartbeat of Egyptian life, faltered, leaving fields of cracked mud where lotuses once bloomed. Priests in Karnak adjusted their calendars, sacrificing to Hapi the flood god in vain as the empire's reach shrank to the river's banks. Across the sea, the Mycenaeans did not fare so well. The grand palaces of Pylos, Tiryns, and Mycenae itself lay in smoking ruins, or were simply abandoned. The great hall of a Mycenaean king held the body of a noble with his golden mask untouched. Death had come too swiftly for proper ceremony. In the olive groves outside Miletus, farmers would later find ancient graves filled with helmets and spears, as if the men had simply never come home. The mighty Minoan palaces of Knossos and Phaistos, already shadows of their former glory, saw their frescoes fade as hearths went cold. The storied walls of Troy, if still standing, were now merely echoes. Its real conquest was time and memory. One by one, cities and kingdoms blinked out. Trade ships sailed to discover deserted ports. Armies marched into empty fields. By the end, the Bronze Age world was a husk. Proud civilizations had dissolved into legend overnight. In the Tholos tombs of mainland Greece, skeletal analyses reveal a spike in violence, arrowheads embedded in bones, signs of hasty cremations. The palace at Gla, a Mycenaean fortress, shows burn layers from a single conflagration, its megaron halls reduced to char. Oral traditions preserved in later Homeric epics echo this void, the Iliad's heroes fighting over a world already half lost, their laments for a golden age that had crumbled to dust. Today we piece together this story from stones and bones. Archaeologists brush dust from tablets and shards, reading the last letters of dying empires. In a Damascus basement, a crackled tablet spoke of sorrow and ruin. In Luxor, the hieroglyphs of Medinet Habu concede only that the pharaoh fled the battlefield. We date burnt layers in ash to the hour and ring tree trunks in Anatolia to the season. In labs, paleoclimate experts core stalagmites from caves, One found a spike of heat around 1200 BCE, another turned lake sediments that showed nearly no rainfall. A forensic archaeologist in Cyprus discovered ancient pollen telling the same. It all fits a single frame, a century of drought, plus one final battle of iron against bronze. Multidisciplinary teams at sites like Tel Kabri in Israel sift through ash layers, finding carbonized figs and lentils, remnants of a final meal. Isotope studies on teeth from Hattusa graves indicate migrants fleeing famine, their enamel scarred by nutritional stress. The evidence converges like tributaries into a river. Seismic data from the Levant points to earthquakes fracturing aqueducts, while mycological traces in sediments hint at fungal blights on crops. This mosaic of clues, pieced together in university labs from Istanbul to Chicago, paints not just a collapse but a symphony of failures, each note amplifying the discord. In libraries, scholars search for meaning. A historian recalls that in Judges the earth is made to tremble when heroes march. Perhaps she reads into that the memory of earthquakes here. A geographer thinks of Exodus plagues, of boils and locusts sent by displeased gods, and wonders if Ugarit's plague was the biblical pharaoh's revenge and later memory. A physicist even compares those migrations of peoples to currents of air, push a vacuum at one edge of the Mediterranean, and somewhere else something falls in. The result is always the same, a cascade of collapse. There is no smoking gun, but the conspiracy of clues is overwhelming. One scholar speaks of a perfect storm, another of dominoes falling. A climatologist calls it an ancient climate catastrophe, an economist, the breakdown of the trade network. None negates the others, perhaps because the truth was larger than any single tragedy. Systems theorists model it as a network failure, remove key nodes like Ugarit's port, and the graph unravels. Anthropologists delve into the human cost, interviewing descendants of Levantine peoples whose folklore still whispers of the time the sea brought wolves. Philosophers ponder the fragility of complexity, how empires, like ecosystems, thrive on balance but shatter under perturbation. Between those victims and us, there are centuries of silence. No inscription on a pyramid carries their final thoughts. Instead, only the monuments that survived stand mute. A broken statue of a Baal bull overgrown with vines, a smashed Mycenaean amphora wedged in a wall. In those ruins we find their answer to the question of survival. One temple was left with a loaf of bread half-baked in its oven, one palace had an infant sandal by its steps. They tell us the daily bustle simply stopped, and nobody rewrote history afterward. Their rulers vanished, their scribes died, and their gods held no parades. Only we, with our lights and libraries, have the luxury to wander on the wheel of fate. Wandering the reconstructed streets of modern Ugarit replicas in museums, we touch replicas of those clay tablets, feeling the indentations of desperate fingers. Satellite imagery reveals ghost outlines of forgotten cities under Syrian fields, while divers off Turkey's coast recover bronze ingots from sunken trade ships, silent sentinels of a drowned economy. These artifacts humanize the abstract. A woman's bronze hairpin, bent in flight, a child's toy chariot, wheels frozen mid-turn. They remind us that behind the annals were lives. Midwives attending births amid rationed oil, elders recounting epics by hearthfires now cold. And as we reflect, echoes of ancient texts color our tone. The psalmist's voice seems to answer, "He will silence the noise of strangers, and the clamor of the mighty will come to naught." A prophet's warning repeats in our ears, "The earth shall shake, and kingdoms fall." Even the Islamic verse about arrogance and ruin feels apt. A land that denies its own people's needs finds its roofs collapse in wind and fire. None of those writings describe this collapse explicitly, but their themes, divine judgment, hubris, desolation, mirror the archaeological record. Men in cages of ideology or disbelief wrote them, yet their shadows dance among the clay shards we uncover. Pride and neglect are universal. In every clay tablet's pleading words or buried altar we see that one lesson: civilizations, no matter how mighty, can vanish. These scriptural resonances invite deeper contemplation. The Sumerian lamentation over Ur, a dirge for a fallen city, parallels the silence of Hattusa, its ziggurat reduced to rubble. Zoroastrian texts from later Persia evoke a cosmic battle of order versus chaos, echoing the Bronze Age's unraveling. Across faiths, the motif persists, a reminder that hubris invites nemesis, whether from gods or geology. What do we learn from that final day as the smoke cleared from Bronze Age ruins? First, that it was never one cause but many. 1,000 tablets now say famine, war, earthquake, plague, rebellion, all stabbed at the age's heart at once. A second lesson, the collapse was sudden only in hindsight. To the kings, it must have felt inevitable, the outcome of years they barely understood. A third, all the defenses of an old world might stand until a single summer, then crumble like sandcastles before one last big wave. Fourth, resilience lies in adaptation, survivors in the Iron Age villages that rose from the ashes, like those in Philistia, forged new tools from local ores, their simpler societies enduring where palaces failed. These lessons, distilled from stratigraphy and scrolls, challenge our own narratives of progress, urging a humility before the forces that birthed and broke the ancient world. Now, in our own age, the world has changed names, but similar threads run still. Empires grow and shrink, trade binds us to continents, and yes, the climate still wavers, unseen diseases emerge, and wars still rage. The ruins of Ugarit and Hattusa whisper across the millennia. Beware, they seem to say. From us learn what happens if bread runs out and armies fail. In our cities today we dine by candlelight, praying no foe will invade our cornfields, just as they once did. We are confident this dawn will not be their last. But if we disregard these silent tablets, they who bore witness to that end, we may find ourselves living in the echo of their story's final scene. Modern parallels abound. The Syrian refugee crisis mirrors ancient migrations. Climate models predict Mediterranean droughts akin to 1200 BCE. Pandemics like COVID-19 expose supply chain frailties. Policymakers cite the Bronze Age in reports on resilience, while activists invoke it in calls for sustainable trade. The Hittite Treaty's emphasis on mutual aid resonates in today's UN charters, a faint echo urging cooperation over conquest. In the end, there are no monuments raised to their collapse, no page of scripture that neatly lays out the cause. There is only the great silence of abandoned courtyards, and the canyon of questions that follows. The day the Bronze Age fell was not written in gold, but in ash. Now it is our turn to write our own line. Will history repeat, or did we finally learn from the voices of the dust? The ruins answer only with quiet, leaving us and the future as the last echoes of their ancient story. As we stand amid the ghosts of those harbors, waves lapping at foundations long submerged, we feel the weight of contingency. One more rain, one alliance held, one plague averted, and the world might have spun differently. Yet in that fragility lies beauty, the human spirit, rising from ash to etch new tales. The Bronze Age's end was not oblivion, but transformation. A dark interlude, birthing the Iron Age's forges, the Phoenicians' alphabets, the seeds of classical antiquity. In pondering its fall, we honor not just loss, but the enduring spark that rebuilds from ruin.